Okay, hello Ling 201. We're back. Today we're going to move on with phonetics by talking about what I like to call the dimensions of articulation, or another way to think about it is sort of the properties of the gestures we use to actually articulate sounds in speech. Before I get into that, I do want to kind of go back a little bit and talk about a few things that were kind of leftovers from the previous lecture. The first of these is a consonant sound that is listed in the textbook. If you've been following along in the textbook, it's got this creature which looks like an upside down W or perhaps spiky M, depending on how you look at it. I didn't really mention this one because most Canadian speakers of English don't have this sound in their variety of English, but it's still kind of fun to think about. It's listed, if you've looked at the table of consonants in the textbook, it's down here in the bottom right corner. And when I'm talking about dimensions of articulation, I'm going to talk about basically these two dimensions listed out here, or three is probably a better way to think about it because there's kind of two dimensions listed here vertically. But this one is right next to the W because it's the voiceless version of a voiced W. I'll explain what that means in a bit. It's possible that if you do have this sound, then you're going to have it in words like which or whether or why, words that begin with WH. So some people make a contrast between which, like which book are you reading, versus which, like, from The Wizard of Oz or what have you. Most Canadians, however, just replace this one with W. If you are not one of those speakers, though, you might appreciate this video, which was I was clued into this video by a student a few semesters ago. More years than I like to think about, but it's still kind of funny. Anyways, as usual, I have a feeling this is not going to make it through YouTube's copyright catcher, but we'll see. It's always fun to try. So I'll play this for you, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy it. Otherwise, I'll put a link up underneath the video on YouTube. But here we go. This is from Family Guy, if you've ever watched that show.
Ooh, you got some pie, eh? Can I have a piece?
Sure.
Ooh, let me have some of that Cool Whip.
What'd you say?
You can't have a pie without Cool Whip.
Cool Whip?
Cool Whip, yeah.
You mean Cool Whip?
Yeah, Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
You're saying it weird. Why are you putting so much emphasis on the H?
What are you talking about? I'm just saying it. Cool Whip. You put Cool Whip on pie. Pie tastes better with Cool Whip.
Say whip.
Whip.
Now say Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
Cool Whip.
You're eating hair!
All right, so one of those speakers had this sound in their phonemic inventory and the other did not. The dog just has a W. I will also point out that there is this symbol R here listed in this table as an alveolar sound. We're going to walk through what alveolar means here in a second. It is not an alveolar sound, so I'm going to just point out to you right now, it should be over here in this column, which is labeled alveolo-palatal, or maybe palatal. We'll also talk about that, but don't be misled, please. The way people actually produce this one in English, or at least in Canadian English and American English as well, is as a post-alveolar sound or alveolo-palatal sound. Okay, also another opportunity for a pop culture reference, sort of, is to talk about the difference between a wedge and a schwa. So I said for this class you don't have to worry about wedge. These two vowel sounds are very close to each other, and so, in fact, they're so close it's not even really worth it if you're just taking this class to learn the difference. And instead, I just want you to transcribe anything that sounds like an sound as a schwa for this class. So forget about this one. We'll just focus on this one. But I will play you a couple of examples of what the difference between the two sounds like, and I'm going to take these examples from an old Bruce Springsteen song. I went through a phase where I really liked his music, and one of the funny things about Bruce Springsteen is that he's from New Jersey, famously, but he also derives influence from sort of old blues musicians from the South, and in many of his songs kind of tries to sound like he's from the South. Again, adopt the music, adopt the language too. but sometimes he's better at that than others. So I've got the vowel chart that's listed in the book for the dimensions of vowel articulation, and it's got both the schwa and the wedge listed here right in the middle, the central middle part of the space. I'm also going to point out this wedge should be further back, but let's hold on for a second and first listen to the distinctions between these two. So going back to the issue of the South and schwa, so I mentioned that kind of the distinction you can rely on between schwa and wedge is that schwa is in unstressed syllables, like the in about, the first vowel in about. And then, I'm blanking on a example for wedge, but let's say the word hut, H-U-T, has a wedge in it because you can stress the word hut, something like that, or buck, something like that. That sound is supposed to be wedge. In the southern United States, a lot of speakers are able to put schwa in that same sort of stressed context, so it sounds a little bit different the way it's said down there. So, or the way somebody with that variety of English speaks. So I might say drugs with a wedge in the vowel as the vowel in that syllable, drugs. In the South, they might say it with more of a schwa, like drugs versus drugs. I'm not doing the greatest job of emphasizing that, so I'll emphasize it a bit more. Drugs, like that. And so Bruce Springsteen, in trying to copy Southern American speech, kind of often tries to do the same thing, and it gets complicated because he's singing, so different things happen when you sing. But let's listen to this brief clip from The Boss.
Times are tough, love was not enough.
That was a little too loud. So we'll try it again. But he says tough and enough.
Times are tough, love was not enough.
Okay, so in theory, you're supposed to have the same vowel in both of those words, tough and enough. I would normally have a wedge in both of those contexts. But when he says tough, he's actually pronouncing it more in kind of the southern style with a schwa. And that enables you to hear maybe a little bit better the distinction between schwa and wedge. The first one is going to be a schwa.
Times are tough, love was not enough.
I'll just isolate them here. Here's tough, and here's enough. That's the distinction between schwa and wedge. And I just noticed for some reason for the first time I'm playing it today, that there's the word love in the middle of those two words, and his love vowel is kind of in the middle of those two vowels as well. I guess he's making a transition.
Times are tough, love was not enough.
Yeah, it's easily confusable, these two. So for this class, just use schwa, and if you want to become an expert or closer to an expert, then take my 341 class, and then take my 441 class after that, because you learn about these things, and we have a lot of fun too. I will also say that this is not right. I mentioned this before, but wedge is not a central vowel. We'll talk about what that means at the end of this lecture. It is a back vowel. It's a little confused here because they've got a little partition here, sort of closing off the rounded vowels from the non-rounded vowels. So wedge is not rounded, but it is back. So maybe that's why they didn't want to put it here. But yeah, try not to be misled by this diagram. I'm just going to show you what mistakes it's making, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Let's go back and just do a quick and dirty review. What did we learn last time? We talked about phonemes. We talked about phones. So phonemes are sort of sounds at the level of contrast in our mind. Phones are just the sounds that are out there as we produce them or as they transmit themselves through the air in acoustic sound waves. And then allophones are sort of the particular phones that relate to a specific phoneme. And so different one individual phoneme can kind of relate to different allophones depending on the context in which that phoneme is produced. We learned over the past two lectures about phonetic transcription, how we're just going to write down the sounds that people actually say, how we represent those sounds with respect to sort of these phonemic contrasts, these meaningful contrasts in sounds in a particular language. We learned about all the basic phonemes of the English language. I think we tallied up 38 by the time we were done. And we also talked about the principle of contrast, how individual sounds can signal the difference between, or the meaningful difference between two different words. So I'm not going to go over all that again. You can always watch the videos if you want to, or review the notes. This time we are going to focus on what's actually going on when we produce the sounds that we have in English. So how are we moving our mouths around? How are we moving organs of speech around as we get these sounds out of our mouth? What needs to happen in order for us to be able to speak? Okay, so a lot of technical details here. And again, there's going to be a fair amount of memorization for this. There's no way around it really. You just kind of have to learn the facts. So I'm going to walk you through this step by step. Hopefully slowly enough so that it's not overwhelming all at once. But if you can't remember it all, I'd recommend reviewing it multiple times because I do want you to know this. It's the way the human body is structured is kind of arbitrary with respect to language, but patterns emerge out of that structure, which are important for understanding phonology, the rules of how we put sounds together in language. Okay, so these are the basic tools of the trade we have in speech. Most of the time when we are speaking, air is coming out of our mouths. How does that happen? The air originates in our lungs. We actually, to get air flowing out of our mouths, we have to get that air out of the lungs by compressing the lungs. This little diagram has the diaphragm down here at the bottom of the lungs. When I was a kid in music class way back in elementary school, I remember our teacher would often say, you have to sing through your diaphragm. And I thought this diaphragm was this big muscle that would move the air out of my lungs. It's a little bit different from that, actually. When you engage your diaphragm, it actually kind of moves in the opposite direction from your mouth. It contracts and gets lower. Sort of. It's actually more of a tool for breathing in than it is for breathing out. There are other muscles, though, that when you contract them around your rib cage and whatnot, that make your lungs smaller. And when you make the lungs smaller, it compresses the air inside the lungs, and it travels out through this structure called the trachea to this little bumpy spot in your throat called the larynx. And then from there, it moves into your pharynx, possibly through your nose, most likely through your mouth. Either way, that passageway inside your mouth is called the vocal tract, and when air comes out of your mouth in speech, it creates acoustic sound waves, which we can perceive in meaningful ways. So that's the basic mechanism for getting air flowing through this entire system. We're going to focus in more detail on how this is structured and how we use these sort of biological structures of our mouths and our nose to create meaningful contrasts in speech. Okay, so a primary distinction in terms of how we do this is between vowels and consonants, which is a distinction I'm going to assume you're familiar with, or at least have heard about at some point. So with vowels, when we have air flowing through our vocal tract above the larynx is right here, then it's going to be unconstricted flow of air. So we're basically letting the air flow without anything really getting in its way. We kind of push it around a little bit, but not that much so that we can, hear the kind of obstacles in the path of the flow of air. Consonants, however, are the opposite of that. So with a consonant articulation, you completely constrict the flow of air. You maybe stop it, or you severely constrict it so that you're getting some turbulence that you can actively hear. And it does not flow through the vocal tract smoothly as it would for a vowel. Okay, so those are kind of the extremes of the distinction. There's some in-between sounds as well, but consonants basically make it difficult for air to flow through your mouth. Vowels, it's easy for air to flow through your mouth. I got this little note here about for consonants, because it's difficult for air to flow through your mouth. It's usually the case that sound gets created at the constriction you make for the consonant. We're going to look at the production of consonants first. We're going to look at the mechanisms involved with that, because it's easier to get a sense of what you're doing with your articulators when you produce a consonant. Usually there's some sort of contact that gets made where you can sense what's happening with your tongue or with your lips or what have you. Vowels, it's a little more loosey-goosey because you're not really making contact with anything, but we'll figure that out as well. Okay, consonants first. So consonants are produced with more obstruction of the airflow through the vocal tract than vowels. We just talked about that. They are characterized by a set of attributes, which you can think of as features or, like I said, dimensions of articulation. And we'll walk through these step by step to see how they work specifically with the sounds of English. But the first one is called voicing, which describes what you're doing with your vocal folds. Your vocal folds are hiding behind here inside your larynx in the middle of your throat. The second one of these is called the place of articulation. So that's the location of the consonantal constriction in your vocal tract. And on top of that, we have manner of articulation, which describes what type of constriction you're making in your vocal tract. I will mention as well as I'm going through these, again, there's a lot to remember here or memorize here. So normally when I present these in class, I like to write all this stuff down on the board so you have some time to write it down yourself. That makes it easier for you to remember it over time. Can't really write things down here in the same way without, I guess, just doubling everything I'm saying on a whiteboard or something, I guess. I'm not going to do that. I am just going to walk you through the notes and then go through it in detail again later. But it's not a bad idea for you to write this stuff down as I go through it because, like I said, that does help you remember it. It's the first step in memorizing all these details. All right, sorry for that little break there. I finally said so many stupid things in a lecture that I decided to start over again. But let's start with a clean slate here. Our first feature, our first dimension of articulation for consonants is voicing. Okay, so what happens with voicing? Air gets pushed out of your lungs and it will pass through your trachea, which again is down here at the bottom of your throat. Normally you can feel this. There are a few rings of cartilage here, which you can feel with your finger if you so desire. Above that, there is a sort of bumpier protuberance called the larynx. This is actually a bigger cartilage, technically speaking, the one that kind of sticks out here, called the thyroid cartilage. You may have heard this structure referred to as the Adam's apple, which it's called for sort of traditional reasons I'm not going to get into at the moment. Normally it's a little more prominent, though. The Adams kind of refers to the fact that it's more prominent in guys than it is in women, but both members of both sexes have this structure, otherwise they wouldn't be able to speak. So no matter who you are, you should be able to feel this. It's just kind of convenient that it's a little more prominent in my neck than it is in maybe most. So that's the larynx, and hiding behind that cartilage structure are two vocal folds, which are combinations of ligaments and membrane, which can be open and closed. So I can kind of represent them here with my hands. So if you think of this, of the tips of my fingers as the point where the two vocal folds connect in the front of my throat, in the front of this thyroid cartilage structure, they stay closed there, but you can open them from the back like this. And if the vocal folds are open, then air coming up from the lungs can pass through them cleanly and create what's called a voiceless sound without making any noise. But if they do stay together and you hold them together lightly, then when air gets pushed up from the lungs, it can produce this cycle of opening and closing where they pop open and then come closed again due to interesting physical reasons, which I won't get into. But then that opening and closing, that sort of repetitive closing causes a sort of buzzing sound, which we call voicing. So if the vocal folds are open and not creating any sound, they're voiceless, that's a voiceless sound. And if they are together lightly and create that sort of buzzing sound, it's called a voiced sound. So I'll show you what this looks like in a diagram here. This is sort of the neat and clean version. I will mention that if you keep moving on with linguistics and take my phonetics classes, or even if you don't, if you simply join the Verbatim Linguistics Club, every year they have a field trip over to the cadaver lab at the hospital, the university hospitals, where we can actually take a look at human bodies in their real form and see what actual anatomy looks like rather than diagrams in a textbook. It's a lot more complicated in reality than it is in the textbook, which is why I'm showing you these pictures here. But either way, that's an interesting educational experience, and I'd recommend it if you feel like you're up for it. If not, let's focus on this for the time being. And again, this shows you basically what these look like. These little vocal folds, when you see them in reality, you find out that they're about this long. So it's, yeah, pretty small to see. It's a lot easier with these diagrams. When the vocal folds are open like this, air comes out through your lungs. They don't make any noise. The air just kind of passes cleanly through. And when they're closed like this, they can kind of pop open and closed and make that buzzing sound. So the basic, easiest example to sort of be able to feel or perceive between voicing and voicelessness is if you produce the sound S and hold it. So I'm going to actually ask you to do this at home or wherever you're watching this. Normally we do it in class and you feel a little bit less ridiculous when there's 100 people doing it all at the same time. But I want you to put your fingertips around your larynx here. Just find out where it is in the middle of your throat and hold your fingers there. And then make the S sound, which is a voiceless sound. So air is passing through these vocal folds without making any sort of turbulence or noise. And then switch as you're holding that S to a Z sound and go S. And you should be able to feel when you go to that Z sound, which is voiced, the buzzing of your vocal folds as they come together and close at a very rapid rate. You can both feel that and hear it. That's voicing. So there's a number of voicing contrasts between English consonants. Here's that S versus Z contrast that I just mentioned. But all of these guys are called fricatives. That's a specific manner of articulation. And they're usually the ones where it's easiest to perceive that voicing versus voiceless distinction. So f versus v, you should be able to do the same trick with those two. And what makes these guys convenient for perceiving this distinction is you can kind of keep these articulations going for an extended period of time. So you can say that for quite a while, just like theta versus ev. That's the subtle distinction between these two, even though they're normally spelled the same way. Try to pay attention to whether or not you're voicing the th in English words to figure out whether you should transcribe that th with a theta or an ev. And likewise, esh versus zh, sh, that's a voiceless versus voiced contrast. These consonants have a similar contrast in terms of what you're doing with your vocal folds. It gets complicated though because you can't really keep these sounds going indefinitely. They just kind of happen in an instant. So if you are voicing them or not voicing them, that voicing goes by in an instant as well. It's harder to perceive. So these first six are called stop sounds. Like a p versus b, you're stopping the flow of air through your mouth when you produce them. The p is voiceless, the b is voiced. I'm trying to think of a particular contrast between the two in the middle of a word. I can't off the top of my head come up with one. I should have planned ahead. But the word like upper is has a P in the middle, upper. Maybe you can feel this, upper, maybe not. You stop voicing in the middle of that word for the P. If you say a word like rubber, buh, you keep the voicing going all the way through. But like I said, for these, it goes by really quickly, so it's hard to perceive. But just keep in mind, b, d, g are voiced, p, t, k are voiceless. Similarly, these guys, which are combinations of voiceless stops and fricatives or voiced stops and fricatives, ch versus j. The ch is voiceless, the j is voiced. Okay, I'm going to show you what this looks like just for kicks. And this is the way we can study voicing in reality without having to go to like a cadaver lab. You can actually film it while it's going on using what's called a nasal endoscope or laryngoscope, which is a fiber optic tube which is connected to a fancy machine. So there's, at the end of this tube, there is a little light and also a camera which can transmit video to this apparatus over here that can be recorded. And the way you get a sense of what's going on at the vocal folds is that you stick this tube up a person's nose and then push the tube all the way back here past what's called the velum or soft palate so that it hangs down the back of the throat or the pharynx and can look down here behind your thyroid cartilage and see what's going on with the vocal folds. And the light has to be strong enough, but it usually is, for you to be able to film this. But you can see when the vocal folds open and close when you do that. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. Just for kicks, this is the methodology. If you just ate lunch or something, maybe you don't want to watch this right now. Maybe take a few hours off and then we'll get to this.
The fibers serve to carry light.
But if you haven't eaten lunch, this could be fun, or maybe just gross. Either way, it should be educational.
To illuminate the folds and to carry the image back up to the eyepiece and the video camera. The tube is inserted via the nasal cavity.
All right. Isn't it amazing what technology can do? All of a sudden, that COVID-19 test doesn't seem so bad, huh? Anyways, let's get rid of a cool lip here. This is what it looks like when you actually are able to film. This is an older video. I'll show you one older one and then one newer one. The older ones are not the greatest quality because they're like from 40 years ago, but that kind of cuts down on the grossness factor. Yeah, so this goes by quick, but yeah, these are the vocal folds here. This is the front of the guy's throat. These are the vocal folds when they're open, so this would be a voiceless sound, and then he'll close them to make a voiced vowel. Like that. We'll do one more, which is clearer. Let's try this one. Okay, there you go, breathing in. So that's vocal folds open. She's taking a breath in to start singing like this or speaking like this. This one's nice because you can kind of see the buzzing, the vibration of the vocal folds as she goes up her pitch scale there. I'm going to show you one more. That's just basically how the vocal folds work. This is a video I got from a friend a long time ago, but still good. So this is going to be Stefan Frisch, who's a phonetician down in Florida, saying the word bogus. And this has a nasal endoscopy view. It also has a video of what he's doing with his lips, and it also has this representation, which you might be able to guess is an ultrasound of what he's doing with his tongue. For this, at this moment, let's just focus on what he's doing here with his vocal folds. So he's going to say the word bogus. The B is voiced, the G is voiced, the vowels are voiced as well, but the S is voiceless. So he'll say this whole word with voicing throughout, and then at the tail end, he'll open up his vocal folds for the voiceless S.
Bogus.
Let me turn that up a little bit, and we'll do it again.
Bogus.
Yeah, and you can see that nicely. We'll go through slowly here. Yeah. This is where he pops it open for the S, right? Everything else is voiced because the vocal folds are together and vibrating. That's how voicing works. It's useful. Like I said, it's not pretty to look at, but that's why our bodies keep it hidden from us until scientists get involved. Okay, that's the first dimension of articulation for consonants. The second dimension of articulation is place of articulation. So we'll walk through this from front to back, from the front of our vocal tract to the back. The very front of our vocal tract is the lips. So that is a place of articulation that gets involved for any consonantal articulation that is made involving both lips. That includes consonants in English like p or b. I've talked about those already a little bit. But when you make a p and a b, you just stop the flow of air by bringing your two lips together, and air can't get out for a brief moment in time, and then you let them go, and air starts flowing out again. You can do the same thing for an M. You close your two lips for an M. In that case, though, you let air flow out through your nose so the air flow can keep going. P, B, M. These are bilabial consonants. And normally I kind of like to walk through this a little bit more slowly by writing it down on the board again. But I'll just point out here without writing anything down that bilabial, Latin I think, not Greek, but bilabial is two lips. So the bi means two, the labial means lips. So a bilabial sound is any constriction made by both lips. Okay, hopefully that's not too complicated. We got more to go. Right behind that, you can make a labiodental sound. So what happens when you make a labiodental sound is you curl your lower lip back. So that's the labio part of this lip. And then you make it make contact with your upper row of teeth. F, fa, like you do for a f or a v in English. So it's a constriction between the lower lip and the upper teeth, and then you just kind of push air in between that narrow constriction. F and v. The F is voiceless, the V is voiced. That is a labial dental sound. It's a lip tooth sound. Okay, moving right along. If you make a sound, the first one we're going to play with involving our tongue, where you put the tip of your tongue in between your two rows of teeth, the upper and lower teeth, like at the end of the word teeth. You should be able to feel the tip of your tongue under the underside of your upper row of teeth. That is an interdental sound. So the root is inter, which means between, and dental, which again means teeth. So this is a sound made between your teeth. Th. We have two interdental consonants in English. They are the theta and the eth. Th, th, th. So this one is the voiceless one. This is the voiced one. Right there. Moving right along. If we go a little bit further than that, we'll reach a place of articulation that I mentioned before, but it's the alveolar place of articulation. So again, you should be able to feel this one if you take the tip of your tongue. You can start at the interdental place of articulation and kind of feel the underside of your upper teeth, and then like kind of lick backwards along the roof of your mouth. And you should kind of feel a bump at the front of your palate. And that bump is known as the alveolar ridge. I don't have any sort of fancy etymological clue to give you for this one. You just got to learn that that's the alveolar ridge. And that's where a lot of different consonant sounds get made, especially in a language like English. So normally the way we make an alveolar sound is by placing the front or tip of the tongue against that alveolar ridge and either making a complete closure or a partial closure. So if we make a complete closure at that spot, then we're going to make sounds like T or D, T being voiceless, D being voiced. You should be able to feel that, T, D, if you make those two sounds, T, D. If you make a partial closure, what we call a fricative sound, then you will make an S or a Z, as we made before. I think we all know by now that S is voiceless, Z is voiced. But you should also now be able to hear a little bit more clearly where the other sort of source of sound is coming for these two fricatives. S. You should be able to feel a little bit of air flowing through that narrow constriction between your tongue and the alveolar ridge. It winds up hitting the back of your teeth, which is why it winds up being so loud and noisy, but S is alveolar. We also have sounds like N. N is an alveolar nasal sound because air can flow through your nose, or does flow through your nose when you make it. N. And also L. L. You raise the tip of your tongue to your alveolar ridge for that as well. You just don't make a closure on the sides for an L. Okay, like I said, lots of alveolars in English. A little bit further back, the book calls this alveolo-palatal. Some people call it palatal-alveolar. There's a lot of syllables to learn and all that, so I'm just going to call it postalveolar. The post just means it's behind the alveolar ridge. So this is when you make a sound that has a constriction sort of between the blade of the tongue right here and this spot kind of a little bit further forward from the middle of your palate, but not quite as far forward as the alveolar ridge. There's a nice little kind of gap there, which we can kind of consider the post-alveolar place of articulation. We make a couple of different fricative sounds at this place of articulation. The first is sh, that sound, sh, and the second, the voiced one, is zh, sh versus zh. To get a sense of exactly where this place of articulation is, I'll go back for a second to the alveolar place of articulation and remind you that we have two alveolar fricatives in English, S and Z. So that's a little bit further forward than the postalveolar place of articulation for esh and zh. So a way to get a sense of where these things are being made is to make these fricative sounds, like say make a sh, and then after you've got that place down, sh, breathe in and go sh, sh, and you should be able to feel a cool spot where the esh is being made. So where you get the narrowest constriction in your vocal tract as you make that consonant sound is where you're going to feel the most coolness as you breathe in for it. Shh. And you can contrast that by making an S, and that cool spot should be a little bit further forward in your mouth than a shh, shh. I'm running out of liquid in my mouth, so it's not really working for me that well. Hopefully it's working better for you, because you don't have to say all these things as you watch this video. I will also mention that we have two affricates or combinations of stops and fricatives at the exact same place of articulation, cha and ja, as you might suspect, because the esh lines up with the esh and cha, and the ja lines up with the ja and ja. And there's also this sound, which we're representing with the R symbol in English. R, r. You kind of curl your tongue tip back in that same postalveolar place of articulation to make this guy. So this one, don't be misled by the table in the book. It's not alveolar in most varieties of North American English. It's postalveolar, a little bit further back. You could try, I guess, breathe in for that one to get a sense of where its place of articulation is as well. Okay, a little bit further back from that one, at kind of the highest arch of your palate, is appropriately enough the palatal place of articulation. So for this one, you make a constriction between the body of your tongue, right in here, and the highest arch of the palate. And we only have one sound like this in English. It's the y sound, y. And this is kind of as far back as you can go with the breathing in trick, but you can make a y, and before you kind of y, bring your tongue down, you can breathe in, and you can feel that there's a cool spot on your palate that's a little bit further back from the one you get from sh. Yeah, hopefully that works for you. It's also like if you pronounce an H in the word he, the H right before an E sound, it's about at the same place of articulation as a palatal consonant like yod. Okay, even further back than that, sort of at the back or soft part of your palate, as is listed out here. That's normally called the velum in anatomical circles, so we're going to call these consonants velar, or they have the velar place of articulation. The consonants we have in English at that place of articulation are stops, like k or g, where we make solid contact, so like k, g. Say that in front of a vowel like ah, like ga, or gob or something like that. Ga, you should be able to feel that place of articulation there. We also make the engma in the exact same place of articulation. So ka is voiceless, ga is voiced. The engma is a nasal sound because air can flow through your nose as you make it. So like in song. There's a G right next to the N in our normal spelling system in English, which kind of indicates that it's velar in the same way that G is, but normally you wouldn't say like put an actual G stop at the tail end of that sound, song. You might say song, but most people just say song. Either way, it's a velar if you're producing it in either case. Yeah. And lastly, but not leastly, there is the glottal place of articulation. So I mentioned this briefly as we were walking through the mechanics of voicing, but the glottis is technically this little space in between your vocal folds. So any sound made there is known as a glottal sound. When you make an H in English, h, huh, you're making a bit of turbulence here. You're bringing the vocal folds close enough so that when you pump a lot of air out of your lungs, there's some frication or turbulence that happens, and you can make a sound like huh. That's glottal. We talked a little bit about the glottal stop, that sound, like in button, when we were talking about allophones of T in English. This is not really a phoneme by itself, but just so you know, this is a glottal stop, which means that you close off your vocal folds briefly, you stop the flow of air there for a little bit of time, and then you open them again. And that's how you can get a sound like the one we have in the middle of uh-oh, uh-oh. It's a glottal stop. Yeah, one thing I don't have listed here is that there is the W sound, either wa or hua, like we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. Wa and hua are technically known as labiovelar sounds, which means that they combine labial or bilabial articulations and then a velar articulation. So we can go back to the velars, I guess. Wa, you raise the back of your tongue to be next to your velum here, and then you also round your lips as you say that same sound. Wa. I think you can see wa, that I'm rounding my lips for it. You probably do as well. It might be a little bit harder to feel that you're raising the back of your tongue as you make that sound in the velar region. Wa, wa, but you do that too. So that's called a labiovelar sound, a combination of lip and velar articulation. Yeah. Wa is voiced in that pair, and the hua is voiceless. That's the only difference between them. But like I said, it's not that common to get the actual hua sound anymore. All right, let's go back to this video. And now that we know a little bit more about place of articulation, let's take a gander at the different places we get in this particular word. So we've got bogus. The B is bilabial. So Stefan will close his lips for that one. And then the G is velar. So we should be able to see that in this ultrasound representation, not in the video one. So this is showing you the way ultrasound works in phonetics is that you can take an ultrasound transducer, put it underneath a person's jaw when they're speaking, and then it will be able to image any of the soft tissue in the mouth as you do that, but it can't go through air. So this white line on top of, this white line here is basically showing where the top of the tongue is, where you get this sort of transition from the soft tissue of the tongue to the air in the middle of a speaker's mouth. So this is the front of this particular speaker's mouth over here, and this is the back of his mouth here. So he's going to make bogus, and you should see him raise the back of his tongue to make a velar closure here, and then he'll raise the tip of his tongue to make the S at the tail end, because that's more of an alveolar place of articulation. So we're going to go bilabial, velar, alveolar.
Bogus.
We'll do that a couple times.
Bogus.
And we'll do it in slow-mo. So we got the B here. Raise the tongue for the G. And then quickly raise the front of the tongue for the S. And as he raises the front of his tongue for his S, he's got to pop open the vocal folds so he gets a voiceless sound off of that. This all goes by really quickly. This is
bogus.
Maybe a little more than a second long, maybe even less than that. So all these gestures of the articulatory mechanisms we use in speech, they have to be tightly timed with respect to one another. It takes a while to learn that. The other thing you have to consider when you are articulating sounds in English is the manner of articulation you use. So I've talked about these in passing, but I'm going to make them explicit here. So the first manner of articulation we'll talk about is called a stop, and that's where you have a complete closure in the vocal tract. We've seen all of these before and talked about them as stops before, but I'll just make it explicit. Like for a p or a b, you completely close your lips, p, b, so that no air is flowing out of your mouth when you produce them. Those are stop sounds. These are kind of really funny sounds when you stop to think about them, especially the ones that are voiceless, like p, t, or k, because they are sounds which are not a sound. You're not making any sound if you stop the flow of air through your mouth, and you're not voicing anything down here either. It's just silence for a little bit of time. It's kind of like the sound that is an absence of sound. And then you can move on to something else. They stop the sound, they stop the flow of air. That's why they're called stops. A fricative is a narrow constriction in your mouth that causes some disruption of the airflow. And maybe one way to remember this word is you can kind of think of it as like friction in your mouth. So fricative gives you friction, and that friction causes some random noise as you produce it. The best examples to give you for this, because they're the loudest examples, are the S and the Z. S, you can hear that turbulence or frication noise at your teeth. S, there's a lot of it as the air kind of passes through that narrow constriction between the tip of your tongue and the alveolar ridge. S, that's a fricative sound. All of these, like I said before, you can kind of continue their production as long as you want, as long as you have enough air coming out of your lungs. So like f, th, s, sh, v, th, z, zh. Those are all fricative sounds. As I walk through these, I'm going to go from sort of most closed to like most open for consonants. So we've got most closed here. We got a little bit open for fricatives. The next one is an affricate, which is a combination of a stop and a fricative right after it. Actually, I'm going to change my notes here briefly and say this is a brief stop closure combined with a fricative or fricated release. So for a ch, that's a t followed by a sh, like in match, match, or judge, judge, so on and so forth. A stop combined with a fricative into one phoneme is called an affricate. Yeah, so just try to keep that term distinct in your mind from a fricative. Affricate combines stop and fricative. You should be good to go. We only have two to worry about, one voiceless, one voiced. A nasal, I've talked about these in passing as well. These are any sound where air can flow through your nose as you make them. All of these, in some sense, you can consider stop to be stop sounds because you're stopping the flow of air through your mouth as you make them. The M is a bilabial stop. The N is an alveolar stop. The engma is a velar stop. But air can still flow through your nose as you make them. So it's not like this flow of air stopped completely as you make these consonants. They're nasals, and it's only in your mouth that they're stops. But M, N, and eng. And again, you can kind of hum along as you produce all these guys and produce them basically as long as you want to. Yeah, I'll give you a fun little video which can kind of show you how that mechanism works for allowing air to flow out through your nose. So this is from a long time ago. Back in the old days, before people knew any better, and they should have known better, but they used to, when they first discovered x-rays, they got the bright idea that, oh hey, we could just like x-ray somebody's head while they're speaking and then see what their organs of speech are doing, which is great and all for looking at what's happening inside a person's body, but the problem with it is that x-rays give you cancer. So they don't do that anymore. Supposedly when they first started doing this like 100 years ago, some people got sick, and I heard a legend that somebody died. I don't know if that's true or not. Hopefully it's not. But what they did many years later, this is a guy named Ken Stevens, who was a famous phonetician who worked at MIT. He decided to just kind of sacrifice himself for the cause of science by shooting some x-ray video of him speaking some particular script here. He, as far as I know, did not get sick from this. This video is only a minute long, though. And what we get out of it is this fun view of what he actually does when he speaks. So here we go. We'll just walk through this all at once, and then I'll go back and kind of highlight a particular couple of parts of it.
Her pe, her te, her ke, her pa, her ta, her ka, her de, her ne, her se, her ze, her sa, hep, het, heck, hop, hot, hawk, her tea, her te, her ta, her tu, her tu, her tet, her tot, her tech, her pen, he dee, he da, he gee, he ga, ya. Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly who wrote the script for that thing. There's some odd statements at the end. I think the goal of those last 2 statements is to try to get every single phoneme in English in 2 different sentences. But it comes out oddly, I guess you could say. One of the great things about this is that you can see the different places of articulation very well in this view. You can see that his tongue goes all the way back here, and he gets the whole thing involved. I want to focus on that part real quick. He says hade and hane. Again, who knows exactly why. So the part that you might not have been paying attention to is this guy. This is your soft palate or your velum. So normally when you're breathing, air just can kind of flow out through your nose through this passageway. But when he starts to speak, well, I gave you the nasal there first, but let's do. So he has to raise that to stop air from being able to flow out through his nose when he makes what we call an oral sound, like duh, one where air only flows out through your mouth. For the N, though, for the nasal sound, he's going to raise it a little bit, but not enough so that it doesn't block the flow of air from coming out through his nose. So there's still a passageway here for air to flow out through his nose, and he's making this closure here with his tongue as he produces the N. So this is an alveolar stop for the N inside the mouth, but air still flows out through his nose. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. We'll come back to that again later. There's a couple of other consonantal manners that you need to know about. The first of these is called a liquid, and it comes in 2 flavors. So liquid kind of gives you minimal constriction in the vocal tract. It's not easy to define it other than that. The 2 different flavors are easier to understand. So one is called a lateral sound. A lateral, or one example of a lateral in English is the sound L. In a lateral, you are constricting the tongue in the center of your mouth, and then air can pass out through the sides of the mouth while being blocked down the middle. So if you kind of focus on how you say an L, I'm exaggerating there, so maybe you can see it better, but L, you squeeze your tongue into the middle, and then air can flow out through the sides. Lateral is a fancy Latin term meaning side, so you can think of lateral as the sides, like a lateral in football where you just toss it to somebody running alongside you. Air flows out through the sides in an L. Retroflex is any even sort of more, I guess, complicated or fancy articulation where you, for most people, or about half of the speakers of English, you curl your tongue tip back, and that's hard to see. We tend to round our lips as we produce an as well, but is the one sound in English that is a retroflex sound. So the way I produce it is I curl my tongue tip back into sort of the postalveolar region. Normally I kind of brace the sides of my tongue against my molars as I make that so you might be able to feel that. But it's still, there's no closure in the middle for a retroflex. If there's a closure anywhere, it's on the sides, but it's open through the middle. And that's kind of like the opposite of what you get with a lateral. Some people, instead of curling their tongue tip back, actually kind of bunch up their tongue. I am not going to demonstrate that because it's very unnatural for me to try to do it in the opposite way I normally produce that sound, but it creates kind of a bunch up of the tongue in that postalveolar region, and it sounds exactly the same. You can't really hear the difference. That's my attempt. Versus you might do it one way or the other. But either way, it's a retroflex sound because you're curling your tongue, and it's in that postalveolar place of articulation. This is our only retroflex liquid sound in English, and I guess I'll fix this one as well. Lastly, we have glides in English in terms of consonant manner of articulation. So a glide, you have the least amount of constriction without the consonant becoming a vowel. So basically these are like vowels that are just maybe a little bit more closed in terms of how open or closed your vocal tract is. So vowels, maximal opening of the vocal tract for a speech sound, but with the glides that are like vowels, just a little bit more closed. These kind of correspond to actual vowels, like wa is produced very similar to the vowel sound oo, wa, make kind of the same articulation but have that sound go by really quickly, and then also with a slightly tighter constriction. Wa. That gives you the W sound in English, and ya is like an E but a little tighter again. Ya. This one is Labiovelar, as I mentioned. This one is palatal. All of these sounds on this slide are voiced. All the nasal sounds we have in English are voiced as well. The only sounds where we get consonant sounds where we get voicing contrasts are stops, fricatives, and affricates. The ones where we have sort of maximal constriction. Okay, I have just a few slides left and a few minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about the features or dimensions of vowels. And I will let you know that vowel articulations can be characterized along 4 different dimensions. And like I said, it's a bit harder to perceive inside your own vocal tract exactly what's going on here because you don't have sort of as clear contact with vowels as you do with consonants. The way they're normally described, though, is with respect to sort of what you're doing with the tongue body itself. So normally at some point along the vocal tract, you have to kind of make a narrower constriction or a slightly narrower constriction of the vocal tract than in other spots. So you have to arch your tongue up or back in some spot to make a vowel of a different sort. And so you can kind of describe where exactly your tongue is as you produce that vowel to get a description of the vowel itself, the vowel articulation itself. So we can talk about the height of the tongue as you're producing different vowels in terms of either high, mid, or low. And then you can also talk about where, in terms of the front backness of your vocal tract, your tongue body is as you produce that vowel. So if your tongue is in the front of your mouth as you produce it, it's a front vowel. If it's towards the back, it's back. And if it's somewhere in the middle there, it's called the central vowel. Try not to confuse these two terms. Mid is reserved for the height of the tongue. Is it high, mid, or low? And central is reserved for the mid spot in the front backness dimension. So front, central, back. There are also 2 other things you can do with vowels. One is you can round your lips as you produce them. We see this easily in a vowel like oo, as hopefully you can tell from the video. Ooh, I round my lips. For a vowel like e, I spread my lips. I'm not rounding it. So that's 2 different settings for this dimension. You can either have a rounded vowel or an unrounded vowel. And then there's also a dimension called tenseness, which distinguishes between tense vowels and lax vowels. And I'll kind of say what this means more in a second, but you can kind of think of this a little bit in terms of like if you make a tense vowel, you're putting a little more effort into it. There's a little bit more muscular tension. And if it's a lax vowel, it's kind of like a lazy vowel, basically. You don't have to work that hard at it. So let's go to some of these what are called mid-sagittal diagrams. So we're kind of looking through a speaker's head as the speaker is saying different vowels. So this is the vowel E. Hopefully you should be able to kind of perceive this in yourself as well. Make a vowel E. You are raising your tongue into a high front position. That's where the highest arch of the tongue is. E. You can kind of feel that near your palate there. For an oo, you push your tongue towards a more back position, and it's still high. It's still close to the highest part of your mouth, towards the roof of your mouth, the palate. So it's high back, and you tend to round, well, you should round your lips when you produce an oo as well. So high back and rounded, oo. For an ah, hopefully you can see that. I'm lowering my jaw, and dropping the tongue back down here into a low and back position. So the narrowest constriction here is low in the mouth, and then also back here in the pharyngeal region or the throat. Okay, so those will kind of provide like the 3 extremes of vowel articulation for us. It kind of creates a triangle of possibilities. There are a few different vowels in this movie, mostly E and ah, so we can take a look at them.
Ne, se, ze, sa, hep, het, heck, hop, hot.
So he's making some ahs here. There's kind of an ah articulation. We'll get a clearer one here in a second.
Hawk, a t, a t, a ta, a tu, a tu, a tet, a tot, a tech, a pen, he dee, he da, he gee, he ga.
So he's got a transition here from E, which is high in front. You can see the highest point of the constriction there, to ah down here. So we get kind of the narrowest point of constriction down here in the pharynx. It's a low back vowel. E is a high front vowel. Yeah. I think for the most part, the reason anyway it has schwas and es in there for vowels is because those are kind of neutral vowels. They're kind of in the middle of the space, so they don't get in the way of like the consonants that he's focusing on more. But this is what is called the vowel space, which gives you all the different vowels we talked about in our phonemic system for English, laid out according to these dimensions. So normally you plot out the height dimension in the vertical space, which hopefully makes sense, and then front to backness is listed here, where left is front and right is back. I've also plotted out that there are a few rounded vowels here, oo, and o. So they have their own little space. They're all in the high back region of the space, or o is a mid back vowel. We can kind of get a sense of what we're doing with our tongues if we kind of walk through these vowel articulations. So again, I like to do this in class because it's kind of fun to loosen people up a little bit. Try to loosen up a little bit and follow along with me at home as you watch this. But I'm going to say these 5 vowels in a row, and you should get a sense of how your mouth opens from a high to low position as you say these vowels. So let's go E, A, A, and you should be able to see my mouth is opening from high to low as I do that. You can also kind of get a sense of front backness by going from one vowel to the next in this dimension. We'll go and maybe that sounds like a European police car to you, maybe it doesn't. But either way, you should be able to feel your tongue moving from a front to back position there, in addition to your lips rounding for the oo. I can feel my tongue moving back and forward for that one. And I think you can see my lips rounding as I go. This vowel space also shows you the distinction between tense and lax vowels. So the lax vowels are the guys here in the shaded part in the middle. Like I said, you kind of don't have to put as much effort into these guys, and that's why they're in the middle. So like schwa is kind of like a default vowel. Like you just open your mouth and go, that's schwa. So that's mid and that's central. It's not rounded. You're not really doing anything to produce it. You just like that. And as you push your tongue around in the vowel space a bit, you get to these other lax vowels like I, so on and so forth. They normally go by pretty quickly. We don't really stress these as much in English. And often when we produce them in North American varieties of English, they kind of start out like but then they kind of often move down to schwa here. You hear that more in the southern U.S., but that's what's kind of going on here. They're lax, so you're not putting as much effort into them. To create a tense vowel, you kind of have to push your tongue out to the extremes of the space. So that requires more muscle tension, basically. E, A, oo, ah, those are tense vowels. So this distinction here between high front E and high front I is a distinction between a tense E and a lax I. Or this distinction, A versus sorry, I lost my voice. So on and so forth. This one's tense, this one's lax. Okay, so I mentioned rounding. Oo, O, and are pronounced with rounded lips. The other English vowels are not. A tense vowel is closer to the edge of the vowel space, while a lax vowel is closer to the center. And I've got this example again of E being tense, I is not. E, because it's tense, also happens to be longer, or usually is pronounced with greater duration than I. That's also part of that tense-lax distinction, in addition to the tense vowels being closer to the edge of the space. That distinction, I will mention, is tricky. It doesn't exist in that many languages. It does in English and like German and French, a few languages, but not many others than that. And often when people are acquiring English, it can be tricky to hear that distinction because most languages have fewer vowels than English. So if you're not a native speaker, one way to kind of signal this distinction between like E and I is to emphasize sort of the distinction in length or duration of the vowel. So my wife is an excellent speaker of English, even though she didn't acquire it natively, but it's a little tricky for her to get some of these contrasts, so she kind of relies on that duration distinction. It makes an E longer and an E shorter for this one here, or A versus A. That's one way to kind of do it. If you are not a native speaker, you still have to learn these distinctions for this class, and it's something that's useful when you actually speak English as well. So I'll just walk you through the entire vowel chart to give you a sense of what these are supposed to sound like, and then that will hopefully give you a sense of how to transcribe them as well. But this is E, I, E, I, A, A, O, U. And I'm done with that. So that's all we're going to talk about for the dimensions of articulation. I'll have one more lecture next time about sort of the suprasegmental features of phonetics. Otherwise, just get to work on learning all these details, and you should be good to go for our next unit in phonology. All right, see you next time.